It has been my tremendous honor to be able to be with you in this part of your annual conference. I don't know if your Bishop Debbie Wallace Paget, understood anything about my story when she invited me to share with you around the theme of ministry with the poor. And I say ministry with the poor because it's much different than ministry to the poor. My grandmother Gladys always had this saying, is that it is not enough to do what she called feeding a person out of a long-handled spoon, and that is throwing money without getting and being in relationship with the people that God has called you to feed and to clothe and to visit. I know this from my own story growing up in the small town of Laurinburg, North Carolina. There was 9 of us, 5 boys and 4 girls, and we grew up in abject poverty. And as I said in the sermon, there were churches everywhere, but I only saw them twice a year, and that was Christmas and Thanksgiving. But then one day, these group of college-age students showed up in my neighborhood. Now, this was a type of neighborhood where when the police came, they didn't come in ones, they came in twos. And the only way that that community was ever in the news is when something violent had happened. And so here were these girls who just seemed so out of place in our neighborhood, and during the summer, my 5 brothers and I, we would roll tires down the street and play with inner tubes, anything that we could find to play with. And in come these girls, and we're wondering, they're different. Don't they know what neighborhood they're in? What in the world are they doing? And they came up to us and they said, we're having this summer-long vacation Bible school, and we'd like to invite you to come to attend. And so we looked at each other and we said, well, you have to ask my mama, because we were quite sure that my mom would say no. But then they said the magic words. They said, we'll feed you. And that was my introduction into the church. They came to us. It was not that old attractional model where we'll build this program for you, then you come to us. No, they came to us and in my neighborhood. And so we went there that all summer long under this tent. When summer was over, they packed up the tent, and naturally we were heartbroken because there went the food, there went the stories of Jesus, there went the singing of songs about Jesus. But they did a strange thing. They paired us up with a neighbor in our neighborhood named Miss Almeda Blackman. And we would go to her house every Friday, and she'd teach us Bible stories. And she had this old upright piano, and she would play these songs. And one of the songs that she would always play was Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I would say, why is this old lady teaching us this song over and over and over again? She would always give us a piece of candy for any Bible verse we remembered, and mine was always Jesus wept. And I would always tell my brothers and sisters, you take my verse, I'll whip your butt. But then Miss Almeda did a strange thing. She went to my mom and she said, Doretha, I'd like to take these kids to church. Now, mind you, we've never been in church yet. The only place we've been is outside under a tent and in Miss Almeda's room in her house. And my mom said, no, I don't want my children going to church. They don't have the right kind of clothes to wear, and I don't want people laughing at my children. And Miss Almeda did a more amazing thing. She says, that's all right. And she bought me the first suit I ever owned and took us down to Mount Olive Church there on Caledonia Road. And we walked up in that church and we sang that song, Go Tell It on the Mountain. And the folk must have thought the Jackson 5 had stepped up in this room. But it was ministry with us. Before we ever walked into church, they developed a relationship with us. A relationship that other people tend to shun away from us. Who is that woman with all those children? Who is that woman always on welfare? The other story that I'll share you about what being in ministry with the poor is about is here in Kentucky. We have an amazing ministry called Grace Kids, and it's run by one of our pastors, Corey Nelson. And I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling his story. I tell it over and over again. And Corey pastors in the shadow of Churchill Downs, and many of you have probably seen Churchill down in the news in Louisville lately. But in the shadow of Churchill Downs, there are children, poor children. Children who have been forgotten, children who are on the margin. And this pastor decided to take this church and make it a church for children. Now, Corey, you've got to understand, Corey is a white man, and when I met him, he had dreadlocks. But he built a relationship with these kids, and he would bring them to church. And he'd feed them. And he'd tell them the stories of Jesus. And so we decided that we would go to this church. And we end up at this church as the bishop. I call him before I come, and I go to this church. And when we get there, he feeds them first. And then they go to worship. And in the worship service, if there's communion going on, Corey would ask a young child who would be willing to help with communion. And each one of those kids would raise their hands. They were so happy. And he would invite them up. And an amazing thing happened. These kids know the communion liturgy better than some of my elders. By heart, no notes. And then there was time of prayer, and there were these pillars all along the altar. And when it was time for prayer, he'd invite them up, and they'd sit on the pillars, and Corey would be on one side, the associate pastor would be on one side. And when they prayed, they leaned into Corey and the associate pastor. But that's not the end of the story. When I walk in the sanctuary, I know something is different because all the back pews are missing. And he's got this makeshift gaga pit in the sanctuary. Now, if you don't know what a gaga pit is, it's one of those things where you make a circle and it's almost like dodgeball and you hit the ball. And he was so nervous that I was going to be upset with him for desecrating a worship center or a church. But when those kids would play that game, here was the object. If you got hit and got out, you were asked a question, and it was always a biblical question. And if you could answer the question, you got to stay in. And there was one little boy, and you could tell by his clothes that he was ragged and rugged and that he'd come from the wrong side of the tracks, and he got hit with the ball, and he goes to Pastor Corey, and he asks him the question, and he couldn't answer it. And he storms out of the gaga pit, and I say, oh, Lord, this kid is mad, and he comes from the wrong side of the tracks. What is he going to do? Is he going to start cursing in here? Is he going to start acting up in here? But this is what he did. I went to him and I said, why are you upset? Are you upset you got out? And he said, no, I'm upset because I couldn't answer the question. It's amazing what happens when you are in ministry with the poor. I would not be here with you now if there had not been people who had took seriously what Jesus said on that day in that synagogue, as was his custom, that the Spirit of the Lord was upon him to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release to those who were oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. In the acceptable year of the Lord is to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, and share words of help, healing, and hospitality. So Godspeed to you as you begin. My prayer is that God's Spirit would indeed anoint you, and that God would keep you and empower and encourage and equip you to do what God has certainly placed on your hearts and in your minds. Again, thank you for this time to be with you. I probably went over 5 or 7 minutes, but when I tell my story, I can't help it. And so I hope you don't mind. But this is important. It doesn't matter whether you're conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, progressive, or traditional. The mandate is the same. Nothing changes about that. Thank you.
Jesu, Jesu, fill us with your love, show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you. Kneels at the feet of his friends, silently washes their feet. Master who acts as a slave to them. Jesu, Jesu, fill us with your love. Show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you. Neighbors are rich and poor. Neighbors are black and white. Neighbors are near and far away. Jesus, Jesus, fill us with your love. Show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you.
These are the ones we should serve. These are the ones we should love. All these are neighbors to us and you.
Jesus, Jesus, fill us with your love. Show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you. Loving lets us on our knees, serving as though we are slaves. This is the way we should live with you. Jesus, Jesus, fill us with your love. Show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you. Kneel at the feet of our friends, silently washing their feet. This is the way we should live with you. Jesus, Jesus, fill us with your love.